son is a professor of history at Emory, okay? And his wife, her daughter-in-law, is my counterpart at Emory, okay? So she's young. And so she was coming up for tenure 3 or 4 years ago. I was invited to be on her tenure review committee. And those things are super secret, because, you have to be candid in reviewing people and just say, well, she was wonderful, Allison Green. And wonderful, there's no question about her tenure. But then, and every now and then I have some social interaction with Hope. And I didn't know if I should tell her or not. I know an awful lot about, your daughter-in-law. So I better wait until it's all over with. So I did afterwards. But it was nice. She works at it. Allison's specialty is, as it happened, white, populist, grassroots Methodist in the 1930s in Western Tennessee. And I mean, people are desperately poor. And I say white because you have to draw lines and know exactly what you're talking about. But it's rough stuff. You see how poor those people were, how just desperate. They didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And but bless her heart, she just really has written about that wonderfully. Excuse me, it takes me a while to bring this up. Okay. Well, thank you all again so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. And tonight, I wanted to switch from Mr. Graham's life to his character. And then next week, I want to go on to think about his legacy, his influence in American culture and in American religion. And there was influence in the culture broadly and in religion, especially within evangelicalism, which he shaped to a remarkable extent. Okay. And let me just begin by telling you a little bit of autobiography. I started this project, I don't know, 15 years ago, and how I got into it is another story. But early on, I knew that I would, want to be close to the people who are right around him. And I knew there was no chance of seeing Mr. Graham himself, but, if I could somehow get the people around him. And I was warned, one of my historian friends, who was a little bit older, he warned me. He said, don't do it. He said, because if you do it, it will defang you. You won't have any critical edge, if you get to know him. My friend wrote about George Whitefield, this very important 18th century figure. So I said to my friend, his name was Skip, I said, if you ever had a chance to have coffee with George Whitefield, he said, well, of course I'd do that. I said, wouldn't that defang you? Well, it's their manner, So anyway, I did make the effort and we got to know his number 2 person. And so I'd gone up there, Kathy always went with me, we'd gone up to Montreat Blowing Rock, Black Mountain. Then we'd gone up there 2 or 3 times and we were having lunch with Manny, his name is John Akers. And I said, I was just schmoozing about Mr. Graham's life, and Akers is the number 2 person with him all the time. And so we're at this restaurant, and so John said, well, we gotta go. And I thought maybe I had offended him or something, gosh. And I said, well, we have to leave now. He said, yeah. He said, Billy's waiting for us. Oh. Well, okay, and I said, I haven't thought about this. I don't know what I'm going to say. And he said, don't worry. He said, Billy will know what to say. So we get in the car, and it's winding our way up to the top, and you never know where it is. It's just a little road through the woods. If you didn't know where that road is and where it led, you would never get there. So you go all the way up to the top. And when we got into the house, it's a nice house, but it's not opulent by any means. I mean, you know, most of us have houses that it's just nice. So we wandered. I mean, John took us all the way to the back where his study was, and he was sitting in an easy a rocker kind of a lounge chair, is what I want to say. And so he got up with some difficulty. He's about 88 at that time. He got up with some difficulty and he immediately moved toward Kathy. He had no interest at all in me. An old Southern gentleman, and he took her hand just like this. He didn't kiss her, he just took her hand. He said, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you." He said, "Now, I just want you to have a good time here. And I've really been looking forward to your coming." And I'll digress a second to say, I mean, it's an ordeal to get that kind of an invitation. And he said, anytime you're in the neighborhood, just drop by. Do you have any idea, what effort we went to, to get here? And then he's kind of poignant. He says, I don't get many visitors these days. Well, that's because his handlers are very, his handlers are very careful to screen people so he doesn't get tired at that time. Yeah. So I just don't get many visitors. Okay. So, we'll be sure to drop by. And then we got to see him 3 more times, so 4 all the time, and they're 2-year intervals each one. And 3 of those were marvelous visits, and I just took tons of notes. And by the 4th one, he dimmed quite a bit. He was about 96 at that point. And he did talk, but it wasn't the same kind of, lucid conversation. And he was wandering around, but still, it was just wonderful to see him. And we saw a couple of the traits that I'm going to talk about tonight. We saw very much. On one side, there's a kind of a negative side, if you see it that way, of name dropping. And everybody says that, Billy's a name dropper. And he is. I mean, and everybody was his friend. Walter Cronkite everybody's his best friend. Whoops. You have to come over here.
I think your glasses, maybe.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, put your glasses on top of them, perhaps.
Okay. There were, okay. So everybody was his best friend. Walter Cronkite, I mean, we've been great friends forever, and, then I'd ask him about, political figures. How about Henry Kissinger? Oh, yeah, we've been great friends, I mean, he's been great friends with everybody, everybody except Marilyn Monroe. And if I'd asked him that, he probably would have, said that. And actually, I want to go back to Marilyn Monroe in a second. So he was a huge name dropper. And, it's just his character, but these were his friends. He did know all these people. And so, he was talking about the people he knew and hung out with and schmoozed with, from all the way from, people who were very much part of the church to Frank Sinatra, who wasn't part of the church. I guess I didn't have to say that. But he was also friends with people you wouldn't expect, Muhammad Ali. And he had pictures of Muhammad Ali around, and then I later explored that with somebody who didn't know about Muhammad, another historian who worked on Muhammad Ali. He said, "Oh yeah, they were friends." And Muhammad Ali at one point said, if I were a Christian, I'd like to be a Christian like Mr. Graham. And Billy had said something of the same sort. He said, if you're not going to be a Christian, then we need to be like, Mr. Ali, because, he lived his faith, he paid for it. So anyway, there was this name drop. It kind of takes you back, but on the other hand, it was nice to see that. But the other thing, was just the manifest humility. And it wasn't false humility. He knew who he was. He didn't pretend to be somebody, else. But it was just, I'll talk more about this a little bit, but you could just feel it. I mean, he was a truly humble man who was acutely aware that he'd grown up on a farm near Charlotte, and he did not have advanced education. And he just said, and I think he truly believed, he had no idea why the Lord had chosen him to do this. But, Lord did choose me, and so I'm gonna do what I'm supposed to do. But over and over, I said, I just don't know why it's me. I just don't have any special gifts. Well, I did have special gifts. But, so it was a combination, and I think the humility far outweighed, the name dropping. I hadn't planned to tell you this, but one thing that was funny, when there was another occasion, there were a group of reporters who asked him, and when he's in his late 80s, asked him what was the most memorable part of his whole career. And he said it was the women. And people were taken aback. Then he said, who prayed for me? Woo! Just keep those sentences going. All right. The leading historian of Billy Graham is a man named Bill Martin, who is a historian sociologist at Rice University. Wonderful man who's in, I think, mid to late 80s himself. And I know Bill quite well, and he's written this sort of the standard biography, 870 pages, and it's a superb biography. And I relied on Bill's work very often. But in the course of this biography, Bill said this. He said, Billy Graham represented Americans' best selves. He represented who Americans wanted to be, whether they were or not. I think that's just a wonderful, he captured it. However much Billy Graham fit that profile, how much individuals may have fit that profile, in just so many ways, he represented what millions and millions of people wanted to be and what they thought should be. So let me elaborate that. I touched on it last week, but there are some obvious features of his life that people wanted to emulate. And a lot of them go back to what was often called the Modesto Manifesto. He was in a motel in Modesto, California in 1948. And he and his two associates, Cliff Barrows, George Beverly Shea, were in this motel. And he said, I want us to think about now, I want us to think about and pray about what have been the downfalls of evangelists in the past. And without much trouble, pretty quickly, they came to consensus. And the consensus was that the downfalls in order of priority would be a lack of financial integrity, the second, a lack of marital fidelity, third, a lack of rigorous honesty about their ministries, and then finally, a lack of an ironic cooperative spirit. So let's go back to each of those. And so he vowed, right then and there, they vowed that they would make each of those deficiencies, in a sense, the pole star of what they would avoid. That's not a very good metaphor, but it represented the pit that they would avoid, and they would take measures to avoid it. And one of the things that I admired about Mr. Graham is that he took measures, and he insisted you have to plan ahead in order not to fall into these traps. The first, financial integrity. And I may be repeating something I said last week, and so I'm sorry, but for the first 6 or so years of his crusades, he did what all other evangelists did, that is, in each meeting, they passed the hat, all right? Often it was just literally a hat. Well, people gave as they felt they wanted to support this ministry. But what was happening is that tons and tons of money was coming in. And at a certain point, Billy said, this can't be. He said, we are being overpaid for what we are doing, and this has to stop. And so what he did is put himself and his top associates on a salary. And it was a publicly stated salary. It was publicly audited. Well, what that did is that removed the cloud of suspicion. And what it also did is it removed any hint that he came in and whipped up the crowd's emotions in order to get them, to give more money, which was a common charge, especially of the divine healing evangelist. Charged against St. Oral Roberts, who was a good man, but whipped up the emotions and then people would give more money. Well, he said, we're not trying to whip up emotions, but we're going to get exactly the same amount of money no matter what. So I think that was one of the really brilliant moves, which some evangelists have reproduced since then, but not all. But later on, Billy was instrumental in the formation of a kind of informal policing organization called the Evangelical Commission for Financial Integrity. And they made a point of trying to get evangelists to put everything up front publicly. The second thing was the sexual morality, and that's gotten way blown out of proportion. In fact, this is what the reporters are most interested in, but it was second on their list. And what they sought to do was, number one, they're all married men, is they committed themselves not only to marital fidelity, but they committed themselves to avoiding the appearance, even the appearance of evil, all right? And, it's easy to be faithful and yet, kind of, get into flirtatious situations. And they said, we're going to avoid the appearance. Okay. Toward that, one of the rules was that you just don't go off, and you're all men here in those days, and they were, you don't go off with, your young secretary to Paris and then have dinner with her in Paris, candlelight dinner in Paris, and your wife is back in, Montreat, North Carolina, raising 5 kids, all right? Avoid the appearance of evil, and then just don't get into situations in the first place that will get you into trouble. We're all human, all right? Temptations come. Avoid the temptations in the first place. Well, that common sense rule has gotten blown out of proportion. And so it's now come to be the Billy Graham rule, in which is supposedly he wouldn't get on an elevator with a woman. And when we had the Crown, you remember on TV, and there was this episode of the Crown where Queen Elizabeth and Billy are sitting in this cavernous room and they're talking theology. Okay, she's asking theological questions. I got 4 or 5 calls the next morning from reporters saying, well, I thought Billy had committed that he would never be in a room alone with a woman. We're not talking about, the Queen in this cavernous stateroom. I mean, it's just the common sense that you want to avoid the appearance and take precautions that you do not get into trouble, all right? I spent an awful lot of time studying him, and I'm 100% convinced that he never strayed off track, and he had many opportunities. And that's another story, okay? The fourth one was rigorous honesty, and there, especially, the problem was evangelists lying about their successes. Not on the evangelist trail, there are no failures, right? Nobody goes into a town and then walks away, with absolutely no results. He said, if there's no results, we're going to say so. And there were some, Billy Graham wasn't always Billy Graham. He had a crusade in the early 50s in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and only a handful of people came in this Altoona crusade. He once had a press conference in Venezuela. Not one reporter showed up. Nobody press conference to nobody press conference to, George Beverly Shea, Cliff Barrels, and Lincoln Ford. Okay. So he insisted that there be rigorous honesty about their failures as well as their successes. And here there's a part of this that I think is especially interesting. Very early on, he had started this before 1948, but right by 1948, he never talked about the number of converts. The press constantly asked, how many converts did you have? And the rule is only God knows who a convert is. He said, what we have is inquirers. We can count the inquirers. And they did. They'd come forward and they would have people, sitting up in the balcony who did the counting, count the number of decision cards that were turned in. You can do that. You can count, but you cannot tell what's happened in the heart. And so that was one of many examples of how Billy said, we've got to be rigorously honest. We're not going to pretend that we know what was in our heart. Then the last one was an Irenic spirit, cooperative spirit. And that's a whole other story of so many evangelists over the years would move into town and have harsh words for other clergy, other churches. And in American religious history, a great example of this is in the 18th century in the Great Awakening, the great revivals of the Great Awakening. One of the major figures was an evangelist whose name was Gilbert Tennant. And one of the sermons that he went around preaching all the time was the danger of an unconverted ministry, was it called. And as it happens, most of the pastors in whatever town he was in fell into that category of unconverted. And he would name names, all right? Really insisted, we're not going to do this, we're going to cooperate. Once, when he was in Columbus, Georgia, he said something negative about another pastor, and shortly after that, he called up that pastor, he apologized, and he said, I'm determined that I'm never again going to do that. What we're going to do is that we will present a positive message, what Christ can do for us. People out there who don't agree with us, leave them alone. And there, I will digress a second to say that, I think I mentioned this last week, millions of letters were sent to the Billy Graham organization over the years. Nobody has any exact calculation, but they do know that it was millions, okay? And most of those letters, I read a systematic sample, Kathy helped me. Most of those letters were positive, thanking him for what he had done. A surprising number of those letters just poured out their heart and made personal problems, addictions, problems with their children, and they would name names. Having a terrible problem with your child, and they have the name and the other, and it's astonishing to me to see how explicit people were about their problems, and they would just pour out their heart. And my sense of this is that what they were doing is that they were treating Billy as it's like a Protestant confessional. If you could tell him, they knew that he wasn't reading these letters, but if you could just tell somebody, and there's a certain kind of protection, the anonymity of a letter like that, you can lay it all out. People admitted that they strayed maritally. And one fellow writes in and he admitted that some years ago, this is not a stereotype. It happened over and over. His young secretary, female secretary, he gets this as a stereotype. Well, this was in fact a pattern, okay? And he said, one thing led to another. And he said, I've lived with this for years. I've never told my wife, do you think I need to fess up? And this was an example where the people, all letters were read by assistants, and all the letters were answered. But every once in a while, they would make sure that Billy himself read the letter. And he read that letter, and he wrote back, and he said, years have gone by, and it may make you feel good to fess up, but is that going to make her feel good? You need to do that. You have confessed your sin to God. You're resolved, you will never do it again, and you've lived faithfully since then. He said, my recommendation is, let it go, let it be in the past. You don't need to hurt your wife by telling her about this. Now, a lot of people would say, no, but that's what he did. He was just very practical about it. Well, anyway, these letters would come in. They literally, in the height of his ministry, they literally brought them in trucks in the morning. The mail service in Minneapolis would have an entire truck. And eventually, I don't know that they were semi-trucks. I don't know how big the trucks were, but they just kept saying they would come in, would buy the truckload. And there were a fair number that were extremely hostile, and some that I have seen threatened to kill him, threatened to kill his wife, and a few that just I saw, and hard to believe it, threatened to kill his dog. He loved St. Bernards, and he had St. Bernard, I imagine people not liking Billy Graham, but, wanting to kill his dog. And what's the reason for this kind of anger, this hatred? It's hard to know. Awful lot of the letters nailed him for his erroneous theology, that he wasn't explicit about this or that doctrinal matter, which usually, Pentecostals who take very seriously speaking in tongues, and people would write in very negative letters. You never talk about speaking in tongues. Well, for heaven's sakes, he's a Baptist. Baptists don't do that, And or if they do it, well, Pentecostals think they do it, but they think the Baptists do it at home quietly. I grew up Pentecostal, I know about that. I mean, we were absolutely certain that Martin Luther spoke in tongues all the time. It just didn't happen to get recorded in the 16th century. Okay. Anyway, so usually it's because he didn't emphasize, their cherished particular doctrine enough. And so this usually, but also there were charges of financial impropriety, which wasn't so. And so he determined that he would not ever respond to a negative letter. And he said, if I start doing that, I would never get anything else done. And so that was the rule. We do not ever respond to criticism. We answer the letter and say, thank you. We will take it to heart. We will listen. We'll consider it. And he wouldn't get into a fight over those issues. So, an Iranian experience. So those are things that I think people heard and accepted. Financial integrity, sexual morality, rigorous honesty, and not getting into fights, simply avoid fights. What I want to talk about a little bit is the ways in which I think Billy failed his own ideals of of humility. He knew that humility was a virtue that we all should cultivate. And I'll get to the point in a little bit about talking about the ways that I think he did exemplify it. But first we have to be honest. There are times and ways that he did fail the ideal. And for one, he was vain. And there's just no way of hiding that. If you go down to the Billy Graham organization today, they have 1.2 million photos in their archives. About 100,000 of them have been digitized. So they can find them, well, they can bring them up on the screen. And they're working to digitize all of them. Billy had his own photographer who went with him everywhere, Russ Busby. And Busby would say, I'm the only person who could tell Billy Graham what to do. Well, you see, Billy was shrewd about this. He had a photographer who caught him, in all situations, and there's no such thing as a bad picture. They didn't exist. You can go down there and you start thumbing through every photograph, thousands, I think thousands, and every one of them. He's handsome, he's impeccably dressed, he got just a slight smile. And he was extremely handsome, and he knew it. And I would say certainly thousands, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of those photographs were posed. He understood what he was doing. He would say, well, this is for the ministry. Well, okay, it was for the ministry, but there was more to it, okay. The second place where I think that he failed his own ideals about humility is he spoke beyond his knowledge. The press interviewed him obsessively wherever he went. They were all around him, shoving microphones in his face. He was vain, and it appealed to that vanity to have these pressmen, mostly men, what is your opinion about this? What is your opinion about that? And they would ask him questions about things that have nothing to do with his background or training. What do you think about the Panama Canal Treaty? Well, unfortunately, he fell for it. And he had an opinion about everything. And and so often enough later on, he would chastise himself and say, why did I speak? I don't know a thing about the Panama Canal. And he would actually specify things that he spoke about. And what it was is that he succumbed to the allure of a reporter asking, what is your opinion about this or that? And so he offered opinions about everything you could imagine. And a lot of them are things he knew nothing about, but still he succumbed. And later on, he did chastise himself because he knew that was a problem. A third place where I think that he failed himself was in his own ideals, is that he loved the limelight. Loved the limelight. He was always in the limelight wherever he went. There were reporters, there were followers, people running after him for his photograph and for his autograph. And he liked it. And, one time his sister said to me, she said, over and over, Billy Frank, that was his middle name, she called him Billy Frank. She said over and over, Billy Frank would say that one of the worst things about his life is that he can't possibly go out to eat without people gathering all around his table and wanting an autograph. And then she paused and smiled and said, but he loved it. And he just, and there's part of it, any of us that, you kind of like that. I mean, he was not a recluse. He liked that kind of a recognition. So there are ways in which I think that he failed his ideal. But I want to begin to talk about the sort of manifestations, the humility, which I think was real. One was the humor, and very often it was self-deprecating. And you could say that, this was just a way of loosening up the crowd. And it was. I mean, good preachers do that all the time. Our preacher does it, good teachers, you have a little bit of humor to loosen things up. And I think that certainly was part of it. But I also think the self-deprecating humor was real. And some of the stories that he liked to tell, he polished these stories because he told them over and over. The story that he told of getting on an elevator in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there was a man who got on the elevator and just looked him up and down very closely, and finally he said, you're Billy Graham, right? And he said, well, yeah. And he said, the man said, you are a big disappointment. So now Billy would tell that story, you see, and people love to hear that, and gales of laughter. Another one that he would like is that, the 100,000 people out there in a stadium. And he would start off by saying, I didn't realize I had so many cousins right here in Los Angeles. And so that humor, another one that he liked to tell, and I'm sure it was true. He was in the Miami airport, and he was strolling through the Miami airport, and this woman just runs up to him, and she said, I know who you are. And so he said, okay. And then she said, you're James Arness.
I can see that. I can see that.
And there's some resemblance. Well, he liked to tell these stories, and they were self-deprecating. And they had their purpose, but anyway, I think it was real. He was free to apologize. And I don't know any other public figure who apologized the way that he did. As I'll talk about next week, he was burned by his relationship with Richard Nixon. Nixon snookered him. And then finally, and I'll talk about next week, the occasion, I did last week and more next week, the occasion in which he was suckered into making some highly lamentable comments about Jews. But I mean, that isn't all. After the Watergate tapes were released, Billy initially denied them. He said they can't be, and then he listened to the tapes himself, and eventually he said, I almost vomited. And not the least of the reasons, and I don't need to use the exact language, but in private, Nixon's language was as foul as it could be, the F word and everything, just constantly. And Billy said he never swore in front of me. I never heard that language, and then when I wasn't there, I mean, just profusion of filth. And so, in a variety of ways. So he came to believe that Nixon had done what the press said he did with Watergate, and then the problem with the language, the problem with Nixon's drinking, his drunkenness, that, press shielded from us. He vowed he would never get suckered in politically again, and that was about 1974. And I would say for the most part, he succeeded. Now, a few times he fell off the wagon. He really was friendly with Senior Bush, and he couldn't help himself. Press would ask him about it, and he'd say, now, I'm not gonna tell you who I'm gonna vote for, but if I were going to vote, I'd vote for George Bush. So he'd fall off the wagon, he couldn't help himself. But for the most part, he avoided partisan politics. And I'll get into a bit of something I want to discuss next week, is that when the Christian right emerged in the 70s and 80s, late 70s, 80s, 90s, Jerry Falwell, Pat Roberts, and others begged him to endorse them. And he said, I won't do it. He said, politics does not belong in the pulpit. He said, I have political views like anyone else. I vote just like anyone else. As a Democrat. He very often voted Democratic. Franklin Graham doesn't tell us that. But he did. He said, I just won't talk about politics explicitly from the pulpit. The gospel transcends the time and the place. It's a gospel for everybody. It's a gospel for the world. And so he wouldn't get into that kind of politics. And then he said, besides that, he said, I don't think Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson spend enough time worried about homelessness and hunger and poverty. I'm just not going to deal with that. They talk about the wrong things, or they don't talk enough about things they need to talk about. But mostly, I'm just not going to have it. Well, so he apologized repeatedly for having been so partisan before then. And he said, I'm going to tell young evangelists, the young men, it's mostly men. Digression. Billy never got the memo about women's rights. Just, there was just something that I can't explain. That's just the way it was. So, but he mostly associated men. He thought his audience was mostly men. And so he said, I'm going to tell the young men as strenuously as I can, don't make the mistake I made. Okay? A second kind of apology that he often made was to his family, to his wife. And especially as he got older, he said over and over, he said, I failed my wife, I failed my family. I traveled too much. On the average, 8 months a year, gone. So I didn't have to do that. I could have said no, and still, maintain my ministry through newspapers and radio, television. And I could have, and I should have been home. Ruth Randall, I love. Well, actually, I am. Later on, Anna was kind enough to ask me to have another kind of a discussion, we'll call it a class, in the late fall on women in American Christianity. One of the people I want to talk about, we'll talk about, is Ruth Graham. Fascinating woman, but she was tough, and she would talk about how he would go off for 6 weeks at a time, and she would go with him to the airport in Asheville and kiss him goodbye. And she said, and I turned around and I walked back. And that's when the tears would not stop. Billy knew that, okay? The kids had their ups and downs. That's another story. And it's like every family, but maybe more extreme. And there were some real ups and downs. The most amazing thing is that they did have more. I mean, you grow up press looking at every single thing you do. It's amazing that they didn't have, it wasn't worse than it was. But they had their ups and downs. And Billy was aware that if he had been home, that a lot of this would not have happened. And then there were some kind of funny things, I think, that he apologized for. And one of them is that he said he watched too much TV. I mean, what? What are you talking about? He's all over the world constantly, he's preaching and writing and, schmoozing with the president of the United States and all this, exactly when are you watching TV? But he thought he did anyway, and he especially spent too much time watching basketball during that season. And so you apologize for what you think of. It's kind of small things, the bigger things, the family, and, really, really big things. Partisanship and talking about things that you really did not know that much about. There were more ways that I think that he exemplified some deep traits of humility. And one of those is self-forgetfulness. To a remarkable extent, he really did stay in the background. He gave his associates credit. And one of the things that he liked to say, he put this in autobiography, he quoted Dean Smith. And one of Dean Smith's mantras was, always remember to thank the guy who tossed you the ball. And God said, I wouldn't be here if there were hundreds of people who had tossed me the ball, by which he meant his organization. And I was down there last week for another reason, down there in Charlotte. Guy comes up to me, and I hadn't seen him for many, many years. He comes up, you remember me? Yeah, I think so. What's your name? Roger Flessing. Okay, Roger. So what are you doing here? He says, what are you doing here? I said, well, these are my people I'm trying to write about, and what are you doing here, Roger? He said, I was Billy's sound man.
Oh,
He said, I went all over the world for 50 years. My job was to make sure that there were speaker systems and that they worked and that people could understand. And he said, Billy was extremely self-conscious and worried about having sound systems that didn't work. And so he was careful to thank the very large number of people who were right behind him every inch of the way. Now, he also knew that people came not to hear the second people. Even his brother-in-law, Leighton Ford, wonderful preacher, I love Leighton, he's still with us. But he knew people didn't come to hear Leighton. He said, they came to hear me. And he knew it. So he said, I will do what only I can do. People came to hear me. He said, I will speak. And whenever I am physically able to do it, I will be the person behind the pulpit. But other than that, I will use people who are expert in doing what they do to make sure that it all happens. Another example of this is, I think I mentioned this last week, he took his own interpreters with him. And he had a whole stable of interpreters, people that he trusted to get it right. He's just not going to leave this chance, to go into Venezuela and just, find somebody who speaks Spanish. He wanted to make sure. So he thanked these people constantly. Another way in which I think that we see genuine humility is gratefulness. Well, no, I want to go back. One more thing about thank you. Kathy and I had the privilege of being at Billy's 95th birthday party, which was in the Grove Park Inn in Asheville. It was a very memorable experience. And by then, he was pretty far gone. I mean, by gone, I mean, mentally. So he couldn't speak himself. But they did have him in a wheelchair, and they brought his wheelchair right up to the front where their microphone was. And maybe he's 8 10 feet away from him was Cliff Barrows, who almost as old. He was in his 90s. He also was in a wheelchair. And so the only thing Billy said that whole evening was that he asked for the microphone. At the end of the evening, he asked for the microphone. He started up there. And he said, "Thank you, but I owe everything to this man." And they were very close, and, you know, I mean, you know, and it was so genuine and so obvious that it's just hard to gainsay the moment you met it. So, self-forgetfulness and that kind of self-forgetfulness moved into gratitude. But there was this kind of deep theological gratitude, which I talked about a little while ago, and that is, he said, when I get to heaven, the first thing I'm going to ask the Lord is, why did you choose me? Now, I say the Lord a pretty good, you know, sense about, you know, all the things really could do, the gifts that he did have. But he didn't say it. He just said, I have no idea. You know, I'm not learned, and I come from the South, and I grew up on a farm, and he says, so why did you choose me to do this? The third thing that I think that is important as an example, or another thing that is as important as an example of deep-seated humility, was, I'll call, he didn't use this term, but I'll call it obedience to a calling. You know, Martin preached about calling on Sunday. Billy was absolutely clear about this, that he had been called. He was called when he was on a golf course in Florida, when he was in college. I'll tell you the time and the place. He didn't say he was called to be an evangelist. He said, I was called to work for the Lord in some kind of public ministry. And the very interesting thing, he never ever could pinpoint the time when he felt called to be a preacher. But he was called to work for the Lord in some kind of public ministry. But then sometimes he would say this, is that when you're called, your life is no longer your own. I think that's pretty profound. You know, you give up your autonomy and your choices about your own life when you've been called. There's no more dimension though. There's another dimension of this calling as he talked about it. It said, the Lord would not have called me if the Lord was not confident that I could do the job. And you say, now is that humility? Yeah, I think it is humility. And when it gets this background of saying over and over, I don't know why I was chosen, but I was chosen. I had no choice but to carry through. And part of that obligation to carry through is to do the job. And don't go around, you know, and say, oh, I can't do this. I'm all overwhelmed. I'm not overwhelmed. I know how to do the job that I've been called to do. So I think those parts of his life are important for seeing. I think genuine humility is self-deprecating humor, his sense that he wasn't so special that the Lord called him, his gratefulness, his willingness to give other people credit. I want to close with this. A line from Aaron Liddell, remember the Olympic runner in the 1920s, Chariots of Fire, remember all that? And you all know this great line, Eric Liddell. I don't know if Billy ever said this, but this is the essence of how he felt. Liddell said, I believe God made me for a purpose. Well, at this time in 26, didn't he set a world record of some sort there, Liddell? I mean, I think he did. 100-yard dash, I believe he was the fastest, at that point, the fastest man alive, okay? He said, I believe God made me for a purpose. And God also made me fast. And I know that when I run, I feel his pleasure. Actually, I have written it down here. a 400-meter race in the 1924 Olympics, which he won at that time, the fastest man alive. The Lord gave me a gift and expects me to use it. And I don't know if they'll use that specific example, but I mean, that was the essence of it. And just one more part of it. The first time I met him, his assistant said to me, said to Billy, he says, Grant's writing a book about you. And he said, why? And then I was taken aback. And so then I said, well, you've done some important things. And he said, no. He said, the Lord has done important things through me. Now, I was thinking about that, I thought about that a lot. You know, if somebody said to me, you've done important things, you know, the first instinct would be, aw, shucks. Now, of course, you didn't want to say more, but you say, aw, shucks, you know, not really. Really never said that. Because if he had done that, that would have disparaged what he knew he had accomplished, what the Lord had accomplished through him. So he was willing to acknowledge the strengths and achievements that he had, but at the same time, it was always a gift, rather than on my own. Well, those are things I wanted to chat with you tonight about character. Not a perfect man, no, there were downfalls. Never, when I say that in public, you know, people always think I'm talking about, you know, sexual issues. That is not the case. But, you know, in other ways, he failed himself and his own ideals. But on the whole, I think, you know, a life that I would like to emulate. Well, I'm very proud of myself. We have 6 minutes. 6 minutes. This is the right time. This is your Greenwich time. So, yeah.
When I was, I guess probably middle school or so, I was watching the Today Show because I waited for the bus to come with my grandmother's, and she always had the Today Show on. Well, Ruth Graham was being interviewed by Jane Pauley.
Oh.
And Jane Pauley, she said, you know, your husband travels all around the world and he's gone for months on end. She said, and you've raised these kids all by yourself, basically. She says, haven't you ever thought about divorce? And she thought for a second, she said, murder, yes. Divorce, no.
She was very quick-witted. Once, their home was on top of this hill, more than a hill, mountain. And she drove her car off the driveway. And the car went way down the cliff. As it happens, she was not hurt, but the car was wrecked. It was totaled. They hit a tree. And so the next day, she went down there and she nailed a stop sign onto that tree. I mean, it's just so typical of Ruth, you know, that she had that kind of wit about it. I'll talk more about her later on, and you know, in the fall when we get around to discussing women. She was more conservative than Billy was, especially in matters of politics. Billy was center left, despite what Fred Franklin was saying. He was center left in most things. Ruth was not. She was, I wouldn't say center right, she was just plain right. Not a virtue kind of her, but she was very, very serious conservative. Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah. And yeah.
Just a quick question from your perspective. One of the things I always, from a very far distance away, thought I appreciated about him was that he did not stay the same.
He did not
stay the same.
Oh, yeah.
I saw him shift. I wonder what you saw as the biggest or more significant shifts in his ministry that you would identify.
Absolutely, that's a wonderful point. To me, the biggest, hugest shift is his attitude toward the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, he was a fierce anti-communist, you know, flag waving, you know, spread eagle, American patriot, anti-communist. By the 1980s, he never came to think the Soviet Union was a good thing, but he came to think that we are crazy if we don't try to cooperate with the Soviet Union. And I don't know if I said this last week. If I did, I apologize. 1982, he went to a conference in Moscow, the Summerlin Conference, and there was huge opposition. And he said publicly, he said, the United States and the Soviets are like two little boys in a bathtub filled with gasoline. And those boys are playing with matches. And he said, that's the United States and the Soviet Union, and we are both about to destroy civilization. And he saw the United States as every bit as culpable in this arms race. We're going to destroy ourselves. So he became and then also he became several crusades in Russia. So the big change was politically, he moved toward keeping politics out of the pulpit, but more specifically, that we have to cooperate internationally. One time, it would be in the 90s, he was discussing why the U.S. had gotten, in Vietnam. And by then, he was shaking his head. He had supported it, like many people in the 60s. But by then, he was shaking his head. And he said, I have no idea why we have decided that we are going to police the world, that was his term. And then he said, why can't we be more like Canada and mind our own business? Well, we don't have to complicate things. But I mean, just to say, as you might imagine, he got an awful lot of invitations from Toronto and Vancouver and everything. But he meant it, it's just Canada's reluctance to try to get out and police the world. And,
One thing that I was always thinking about, of course, is, his relationship, because his wife was raised in China, and then he had such a strong relationship with Asia, especially in Korea, all those things. So he had a real multicultural view of the world compared to almost any other evangelist or anybody in the United States, really.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much you think that influenced.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. Despite Ruth's politics, I may be through it, I don't want to be prejudicial, maybe through it in some ways, but she was acutely aware of suffering elsewhere in the world. And she would talk about it. She said, when I was growing up in China, she said, I saw things that I'm pretty sure 99% of Americans have never seen. The hunger, the suffering, the famine. And, Billy was aware of that through her. And I think I've mentioned that by the late 70s and 80s and 90s, the majority of the crusades were overseas. He thought that's where he was called to take the ministry. Americans had already heard it. It was overseas. It certainly was part of that eye-opening. Yeah.
How many presidential inaugurations was he involved in as far as?
I believe it was 9, and it was more than any other person except John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the early 1800s. And John Marshall was involved in 10, but he was part of 9, and both Democrats and Republicans giving the inaugural prayer, usually. And then just being there, on the platform as a way of trying to, in some way, not legitimize the individual, but to legitimize the process, the democratic process that had brought that individual over in both parties. And then he was invited, toward the end, he was invited. He would have been involved in more than John Marshall if his health had permitted him to participate. Later on, and he just couldn't, he didn't, Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. He overnighted in the White House more than 25 times. People lost track. But as far as they know, no other civilian came anywhere close to overnighting in the White House. And in fact, he'd been in the White House often enough that he told other people which beds to avoid. Apparently, there was one guest room in the White House that had a very lumpy bed. And he said, whatever you do, make sure they don't put you in that particular guest room. But Lyndon Johnson said, whenever you're in DC, just consider the White House your motel.
That's great.
I mean, how often does that happen? And he did. And you just have evidence, and you come into town and, well, I'll give you just one more example. One person, I don't remember who it was, Cliff Farrell or somebody said that he actually was with Billy when he got into Washington DC, that he went to a payphone to call the president. In this case, it was Lyndon Johnson. And put his quarter in, or whatever it was, and then of course you get a certain operator that says, this is Billy Graham, calling for Lyndon Johnson, and they patched him through. I mean, so I mean, he had that kind of access. And if you had that kind of power, I still think he handled it pretty well. Well, we're actually 3 minutes past 7, so I'm sorry for that. Thank you so much for coming. I love talking about this.
That's it. Good job.